Hi friends, welcome to another episode of Great Ideas, wherein I share lessons and insights that have impacted me. Today I wanted to talk about mindsets. And mindset, as you would already know, is something that is a predisposed mentality towards a particular kind of action or thought that any individual has. And I feel that in my experience, more than the actions that I've taken, the mindset has actually made a big difference in terms of how I approach things and how I go about life in general. Particularly, these 5 kinds of mindsets have really shaped my thinking about how I approach things and has transformed the way I look at things, which has significantly impacted and increased my fulfillment, my satisfaction with the decision, and has minimized the regret factor associated with any particular decision. These 5 mindsets are fixed versus growth, and if you're watching this, you would have probably come across this mindset in some piece of literature or the other. The next one is a passive versus an active mindset, something that I'll go talk about later in the video. The third kind of mindset is having a scarcity versus an abundance mindset. The fourth mindset is having a fragile versus an antifragile mindset. And lastly, the fifth kind of mindset is having a paranoid versus a pronoid mindset. And throughout the course of this video, I will talk about these mindsets, and I have linked the exact time of where I talk about each mindset in the description below, so feel free to go through that if you know of any of these mindsets already. I'll start with the fixed and the growth mindset. Fixed mindset is essentially believing that your qualities and your ability to do things is predetermined, and that no matter what happens, you cannot improve on them. In that scenario, you're always trying to prove something to the world. So in every situation, you ask yourself whether this will validate the image that you've created for yourself in front of others, or whether this will fit the perception that you have about yourself or about how others perceive you. And just believing that puts you into this bracketed zone of achieving things only by certain predefined metrics, and that if you don't meet those metrics, you won't be able to achieve or in fact sustain the image that you have created for yourself. In contrast, a growth mindset is something that whatever cards you have been dealt with are essentially starting points for you to only learn and grow further. In that case, you don't have anything to prove to the world. Rather, you are trying to learn as much as you can with the confidence and the assurity that at the end of the day, you would have learned something, even though you may not have proved something to the world outside. And I believe that in my experience, a growth mindset has particularly helped me become a much more contented individual. And I talked about this with my friends also, especially when I came to Berkeley and I started learning CS. Computer science was obviously a novel field for me, and I had never been exposed to computer science before coming to Berkeley. Earlier, there was always this fixed mindset when I was taking the first few courses, and I obviously would compare myself with the average of the class and try to see whether I was able to do better than the standard deviation or the mean. Slowly and steadily, I think that has changed to an extent that I have actually not been that worried or anxious about the curve. Rather, I'm more worried about whether I've actually learned the material. And while I'm still learning, I do feel that just having that growth mindset has made me feel much better about myself as an individual. But at the same time, it has also helped me learn more than what having a fixed mindset would have enabled me to do. And that, I think, is a much more valuable skill in the long term. And that skill is in fact determined by having a growth mindset in the first place and not a fixed mindset. The second kind of mindset is having a passive versus an active mindset. Now, a passive mindset is that in which you don't really take responsibility for your own actions because you're easily able to attribute the outcome of your actions to external circumstances. In contrast, an active mindset is one in which you are the full responsible owner of your actions and their outcomes, and that even if the external circumstances are not favorable to you, you are actively invested in the outcome of the decision that you have taken. Nassim Taleb, who is one of the great authors and economists, talks about skin in the game. And I think that having skin in the game, being vested in the outcome of any particular decision, is essentially having an active mindset as compared to having a passive mindset, wherein you are not really invested into the outcome of any decision, and that when it becomes easier for you to pass on the buck to external circumstances, that is when you actually have a passive mindset. In my experience, I have felt that having an active mindset is somewhat of a similar thing as compared to having deliberate practice. And when you deliberately practice things, and this is something that I've talked about in one of my earlier videos of mastery as well, when you are actively invested in doing a boring, repetitive thing again and again, just with the intent of getting better at it, that is when you have truly adopted an active mindset toward things and activities in general. And therefore, I think that in my experience, having an active mindset has helped me more to be fully invested in the outcomes of my actions as compared to having a passive one. The third mindset I wanted to talk about was having a scarcity versus an abundance mindset. Now, a scarcity mindset is that in which you always feel that resources are limited and that there will never be enough of happiness, wealth, friends, so on and so forth. In contrast, the abundance mindset is one in which you are actively confident about the fact that there has to be enough, and there has to be enough for everyone. And that is what leads to sharing of resources, be it prestige, wealth, power, fame, money, friends, and a billion other things that you can imagine of. And I feel that having an abundance mindset is extremely useful, mainly because it changes the way you approach any situation. Adam Grant, who is an organizational psychologist, studies the concept of givers and takers. And I think that beautifully applies over here in terms of an abundance mindset. And his research essentially concluded that when he went to different companies and studied the nature of individuals and how one company is comprised of givers versus the other is comprised of takers, he concluded that the companies where the giving culture was rampant, those companies far outperformed the companies where a taking culture was rampant. However, that does not mean that the companies where the giving culture was rampant were always outperforming the companies where the taking culture was rampant. Mainly because, especially when the giving culture is taken advantage of by some takers, and that leads to the exhaustion of givers, that's when a company begins to underperform. And that is what he concluded, that the givers are both at the top and at the bottom of the curve, whereas the takers are always in the middle. And how this links back to the scarcity versus abundance mindset is that if you're a taker, you always enter any situation thinking what you can take from that situation, whereas if you're a giver, you always enter any situation thinking what you can contribute into that situation. And that leads to a far greater chance of success in the long run, especially in a corporate sphere or even a personal sphere. In my experience, I've felt that having this abundance mindset and just having this confidence that at the end of the day, there has to be enough for everyone has allowed me to be a much more contented individual with the current circumstances. And that is something that I find really rewarding because it helps me focus on the thing at hand instead of distracting me by constantly keeping me on the edge and making me take more and more from any given situation. Coming to the fragile and the anti-fragile mindset. I talk about Nassim Taleb over here, about whom I've also talked about in one of my podcasts. Nassim Taleb is an economist and an author who's said a lot of great things, and essentially his key ideas revolve around risk-taking, rationality, and decision-making. And in one of his books, Antifragile, he in fact talks about this concept of the fragile versus the anti-fragile. And what he says is that the fragile is anything that breaks under uncertainty. So for example, let's say glass, right? a glass would just break in uncertainty or in high pressure. That essentially says that the glass is a fragile item. Then he talks about the robust, and he gives an example of the phoenix, which essentially rises from the ashes. And whenever a phoenix dies, it rises from the ashes and is back to the bird that it once was. And that is being robust. However, the antifragile is the one who, in fact, grows from uncertainty and thrives under pressure, who seeks chaos and who seeks uncertainty only because uncertainty is the food for the antifragile to grow. And that is what Taleb talks about. Linking this back to the fragile versus the anti-fragile mindset, I think it would be useful for us to develop an anti-fragile mindset wherein we seek uncertainty and grow from every high-pressure situation instead of being fragile and just crumbling under uncertainty or high-stress situations. And to do that, obviously, I'd request you explore the concept of fragile and anti-fragile in depth, because it's a really, really nuanced concept that I found really fun and that I thought would be interesting to share. So that's the fourth mindset, the fragile versus the anti-fragile mindset. The fifth mindset is the paranoid versus the pronoid mindset. And without commenting on whether paranoia is a medical condition or not, you know that you have a paranoid mindset per se when you always feel that the world is out there to get you. When I think that any action that I do is specifically geared toward harming me through some external means or the other, that's when I know that I'm paranoid. In contrast, the pronoid mindset, and I'm sure you would be wondering what pronoid is. The pronoid mindset is, well, you could say the delusional belief that the world out there is there to help you grow as an individual. And Adam Grant, in fact, the organizational psychologist at Wharton, talks about the difference between having paranoia versus being pronoid. And I found it really interesting because while some may say that it is a delusional belief, I also feel that at the end of the day, if I'm able to change my perspective on how I view things, whether they be objectively good or bad, if I'm able to offer an optimistic, positive lens on things in life and think about things in a way that they help me grow as an individual in any sphere possible, that is a much better situation to be in as compared to thinking about things as if they are there to just harm me as an individual. And I think just having this distinction, being pronoid as compared to being paranoid, is something that I found really interesting and thought would be cool to share. So these were the 5 mindsets that I found really interesting and cool. Please feel free to share any feedback that you have. Please feel free to reach out. I love to learn and continuously iterate and in fact develop more mindsets and more distinctions that could help all of us lead better lives, make better decisions, and be happier individuals. Thank you so much for watching.